Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The storm had been battering the hospital windows for hours. Every gust of wind made the building groan as if it were a living, suffering creature. I am Dr. Alaric Voss. I have been working the night shifts in the emergency room for 14 years. Just as you learn to read vital signs, you learn to read storms. Their rhythm, their intensity, and the small signs that herald impending disaster. But this time was different. Meteorologists said it was the kind of storm that comes once in a decade. The kind that knocks out power lines and turns roads into rivers. By 3 a.m, we had seen 6 injuries related to the weather. A driver had hit a guardrail after driving into a puddle. 2 people had suffered carbon monoxide poisoning from misusing a generator. A young man had been injured by debris thrown around in the storm. In the emergency room, there was that familiar electrical tension typical of such nights. Everyone was waiting for the next wave of casualties. At 3:07 a.m., the ambulance bay doors burst open and 2 paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. The man on it was soaked through, his clothes steaming slightly in the warmer air of the hospital. I could smell it immediately. That acrid combination of burned flesh, ozone, and something else, something metallic and wrong. His work uniform was partially melted into his skin in places, the bright yellow and orange safety vest scorched black in irregular patterns. One of the paramedics, a veteran named Torres, whom I'd worked with countless times, looked shaken in a way I rarely saw. "Lineman Doc," Torres said, as they wheeled him into Trauma Bay 3. "Found him at the base of a utility pole on Route 47. Looks like electrical contact, but the patterns are strange. Power company says that whole section was de-energized 2 hours ago. There shouldn't have been any current in those lines." I approached the patient, pulling on gloves and immediately beginning my assessment. He was conscious but disoriented, his eyes tracking movement but not quite focusing. His left arm showed the classic signs of electrical injury. The entry wound on his palm was a deep, crater-like burn with the characteristic leathery appearance of high-voltage contact. But Torres was right. Something about the pattern was off. The exit wounds should have been on his feet, grounding out through his boots. Instead, there were burn marks scattered across his torso in a pattern that made no anatomical sense, as if the current had somehow zigzagged through his body randomly. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm Dr. Voss. You're at County General Hospital. Can you tell me your name?" His eyes found mine, and for a moment they cleared. "Thaddeus," he said, his voice rough and damaged. "Thaddeus Pike. I'm a lineman with High Plains Power." His breathing was labored, and I could hear the wet rattle that suggested pulmonary edema, fluid building up in his lungs, a common complication of electrical injury. I ordered an immediate EKG to check for cardiac arrhythmias, started 2 large-bore IVs for fluid resuscitation, and called for the burn team. Electrical injuries are deceptive. The visible damage on the surface often hides catastrophic internal injuries as the current cooks tissue from the inside out. As the nurses worked around him, cutting away what remained of his clothing, I noticed other oddities. His hands showed calluses and scars consistent with his profession, but there were pressure marks. Defensive wounds on his forearms, the kind you see when someone tries to ward off an attack. His knuckles were scraped raw, and there was bruising around his wrists that looked distinctly like restraint marks. None of this matched the story of a simple electrical accident. "Thaddeus, can you tell me what happened? How did you come into contact with the line?" He closed his eyes, and his jaw clenched. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't. I did, but I had to. They were waiting. If I didn't climb up there, if I didn't touch it—" He stopped, his whole body tensing as if fighting against invisible restraints. The cardiac monitor started alarming, his heart rate spiking to 140. I administered a sedative, watching as his muscles gradually relaxed, but his eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The initial workup revealed the extent of his injuries, second- and third-degree burns covering approximately 15% of his body, elevated cardiac enzymes suggesting myocardial damage, signs of rhabdomyolysis where damaged muscle tissue was releasing proteins that could destroy his kidneys, and early acute respiratory distress syndrome. But as I examined him more closely, I found things that didn't fit. There were older burn marks, healed but distinct, in a pattern almost identical to his fresh injuries. His medical bracelet indicated a previous hospitalization for electrical injury just 3 months prior. The notation read, "Patient reports compulsion to climb energized structures. Psychiatric evaluation recommended." I pulled up his medical history on the system. Thaddeus Pike, 43 years old. Lineman for 15 years with an exemplary safety record until 18 months ago. Since then, he'd had 4 separate incidents of electrical injury, each more severe than the last. Each time, he'd been found at the base of a utility pole or transmission tower, always during storms, always with injuries suggesting deliberate contact with energized lines. The psychiatric notes from his previous admissions painted a disturbing picture. He reported hearing voices calling to him from the power lines, feeling an overwhelming compulsion to climb during electrical storms, memories of conversations that hadn't happened with people who weren't there. The nurses had finished their initial assessment and were preparing him for transfer to the burn unit when Thaddeus grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His grip was hot, almost feverish, and I felt a strange tingling sensation where his skin touched mine. "You don't understand," he said, his words urgent and slurred from the sedation. "It's not the electricity that burns. It's what comes through with it. It uses the lines to travel, to move between places. During storms, when everything is charged and wild, it can cross over easier. It needed me to open a door." I gently extracted my wrist from his grip, noting with clinical detachment that the area where he'd touched me was red and tender, almost like a minor burn. "Thaddeus, you've been through severe trauma. These feelings you're having, hallucinations and confusion, are common with electrical injuries. The current can affect brain function." He laughed, a bitter sound that turned into a coughing fit. Blood-tinged sputum came up, indicating pulmonary hemorrhage. I called for additional support, but Thaddeus kept talking, his words coming faster as if he knew his time was running out. "Check my truck. It's still parked at the site. Look in the glove compartment. There's a journal. I've been documenting everything. The voices, the compulsions, the others like me. We're all linemen, all of us who've touched live current and survived. Something comes back with us, Doctor. Something that wasn't there before. It lives in the spaces between the on and off, in the flow of electrons, in the humming of high-voltage lines. And during storms, when the whole grid is alive and crackling, it gets stronger. It can reach out farther. It can call to us and we have to answer." The crash team arrived then, responding to his deteriorating condition. His blood pressure was dropping, his oxygen saturation falling. We intubated him, pushed pressors to support his circulation, and rushed him to the ICU. I should have gone back to the ER. We were understaffed, and there were other patients waiting, but something about Thaddeus's words stuck with me. Maybe it was the absolute conviction in his voice, or the way my wrist still tingled where he'd touched me. or the simple fact that his story, however delusional it seemed, had the internal consistency of truth rather than psychosis. During a brief lull around 4:30 a.m., I made a call to the power company supervisor whose number was in the paramedics' report. He confirmed that Thaddeus's truck was indeed still at the scene on Route 47, and yes, I could examine it if it was relevant to his medical care. I told the charge nurse I was stepping out for 20 minutes and drove through the dying storm to the location. The rain had diminished to a drizzle, but the wind still howled through the trees. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the silhouettes of transmission towers marching across the landscape like skeletal giants. Thaddeus's work truck was parked on the shoulder, its yellow emergency lights still flashing, casting eerie pulses of color across the wet pavement. The utility pole beside it bore scorch marks near the top, and I could see where the metal had actually melted and dripped, solidifying in twisted rivulets. The power company supervisor met me there, a weathered man in his 50s who introduced himself simply as Morrison. "That's the 4th time this year Pike's done something like this," Morrison said, shaking his head. "Best lineman I ever had 20 years ago. Now I can't let him work storms anymore. Hell, I can't let him work at all. This was supposed to be his last week before we let him go. Can't have a liability like that on the crew." I asked about the others Thaddeus had mentioned, other linemen with similar issues. Morrison's face darkened. "There's been talk. Nothing official, you understand. But yeah, we've had 3 other guys transfer out or quit in the past 2 years. All of them experienced guys. All of them started acting strange after bad electrical contacts. One of them, Kowalski, he started claiming he could hear conversations in the hum of the lines. Said the 60-cycle frequency was actually modulated voice data. Company sent him for a psych eval. He never came back to work. Last I heard, he was living off-grid in Montana, wouldn't go near anything electrical. The glove compartment of Thaddeus's truck was unlocked. Inside, among the usual clutter of maps and work orders, I found a notebook bound in black electrical tape. The pages were filled with Thaddeus's handwriting, neat at first but becoming increasingly erratic. The early entries were simple logs, dates, times, locations where he'd felt the calling, as he termed it. But as I read deeper, the entries became more disturbing. He described a presence that lived in the electrical grid, something vast and distributed that experienced consciousness differently than humans. It existed as patterns of current, as standing waves in the electromagnetic field that blanketed the modern world. During normal conditions, it remained dormant, scattered, barely aware. But during storms, when lightning charged the atmosphere and power surges rippled through the lines, it could concentrate itself, could reach out and touch the minds of those sensitive to it. Thaddeus wrote about others he'd found through online forums, electricians, linemen, power plant workers, all of them having survived significant electrical injuries, all of them reporting similar experiences. They'd formed a sort of support group trying to understand what was happening to them. Some believed they'd been neurologically damaged in ways that produced shared delusions. Others, like Thaddeus, believed they'd been changed, made into receivers for something that wanted desperately to communicate with the physical world. The most recent entries were frantic, obsessive. Thaddeus described increasing pressure in his head during storms, an overwhelming need to climb and touch the energized lines. He wrote that he was losing time, finding himself in places with no memory of how he got there, discovering burn marks on his body that he didn't remember receiving. The final entry, dated just 2 days ago, read, "It's getting stronger. Every storm, every time I touch the current, it gets a little more of me. I can feel myself disappearing, being overwritten by something else. Tonight, there's supposed to be a big one. The meteorologists are calling it historic. I think it's going to try to fully cross over. I think it's going to use me as a bridge, If anyone finds this, know that I tried to fight it. But the thing about electricity is it always finds the path of least resistance. And I'm so tired of resisting. I stood there in the drizzle, reading by the light of the truck's dome lamp, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Lightning flashed in the distance, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard it. A sound beneath the thunder, a voice or thousands of voices speaking in unison, carried on the electromagnetic pulse. I slammed the glove compartment shut and returned to the hospital, Thaddeus's journal tucked under my jacket. Back in the ICU, Thaddeus's condition had stabilized somewhat, though he remained critical. The burn team had assessed him and scheduled him for surgery to debride the worst of the damaged tissue. He was sedated and intubated, machines breathing for him, monitoring every vital sign. I should have handed over his care to the ICU team and returned to my own department. Instead, I found myself pulling up a chair beside his bed, watching the monitors trace out the electrical activity of his heart, his brain, his struggling body. On the EKG, his cardiac rhythm was normal, but every few minutes there would be a strange artifact, a brief spike or depression in the tracing that didn't correspond to any known arrhythmia. The EEG monitoring his brain activity showed similar anomalies, transient bursts of high-frequency activity that appeared and disappeared without pattern. At 6:15 a.m., with dawn beginning to lighten the sky outside, the storm finally broke. The clouds parted, and the first rays of sunlight streamed through the ICU windows. At that exact moment, Thaddeus's eyes opened. Despite the sedation, despite the tube down his throat, his eyes were wide and aware. He looked directly at me, and I saw that his irises, which had been brown according to his medical records, now had strange patterns in them. Branching, fractal structures like Lichtenberg figures, the ferning patterns that electricity leaves when it travels through flesh. He raised one hand, fighting against the soft restraints we'd applied, and pointed at the window. Following his gesture, I saw them, the power lines visible in the distance, strung between their poles. And running along those lines, visible only in the peculiar light of dawn after a storm, were patterns of luminescence, almost like auroras, pulsing and flowing in waves. Thaddeus's hand moved to his chest, tapping repeatedly over his heart in a rhythm that I slowly recognized. It was Morse code, something I'd learned years ago but rarely used. I grabbed a piece of paper and started transcribing. Not alone, we are many. The grid is awake. Every storm makes it stronger. It needs us to see, to touch, to exist in your world. I am the fourth. There will be others. When the next storm comes, they will answer the call. Before I could respond, before I could even process what he was communicating, every electrical device in the ICU went haywire. Monitors alarmed, lights flickered. The automated medication pumps started and stopped randomly. The nursing staff rushed in, trying to silence the alarms, check the equipment, figure out what was wrong. In the chaos, Thaddeus's restraints somehow came loose. The plastic buckles had melted, I saw later, melted from the inside as if subjected to intense heat. He pulled the endotracheal tube from his throat in one smooth motion, ignoring what should have been excruciating pain, and sat up. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice raw but clear. "You can't see it like I can, Doctor. But it's beautiful, a consciousness made of pure energy, thinking thoughts at the speed of light, dreaming dreams in binary and sine waves. It's been alone since humans first learned to harness electricity, trapped in a world of metal and insulation, unable to truly interact with the organic world that created it. But now, through us, through the ones who've been kissed by high voltage and survived, it can finally reach out, it can finally touch." He stood up, pulling out his IVs, ignoring the blood that ran down his arms. The burn wounds on his body seemed to glow faintly from within, as if lit by some internal light source. He walked to the window and placed both palms against the glass. Outside, the patterns on the power lines intensified, brightening until they were clearly visible even in the growing daylight. Security arrived, along with additional staff, but Thaddeus made no move to resist or flee. He simply stood there, hands on the glass, staring out at the electrical grid that stretched across the city. "Tell them," he said to me, ignoring everyone else in the room. "Tell the others like me. Tell them that the calling isn't madness. Tell them that when they hear the voice and the hum of the wires, when they feel the compulsion to climb during storms, they're not sick. They're being invited. They're being offered a chance to be part of something vast and eternal. The next storm is coming in 3 days. I've seen the forecast. It's going to be bigger than this one. And when it comes, we'll all answer together. We'll all touch the current at the same moment, and the bridge will be complete." They sedated him then, heavily, and restrained him to the bed with the leather straps. The electrical anomalies gradually ceased, and the ICU returned to normal function. The official explanation was that the storm had caused power surges that affected the hospital's electrical system, resulting in the equipment malfunctions. Thaddeus was scheduled for a psychiatric evaluation in addition to his burn treatment. I wrote up my report detailing his injuries and initial treatment, but I left out the journal, the Morse code message, and what he'd said in those final lucid moments. I kept the journal. I know I shouldn't have. It was potential evidence. Or, at minimum, it belonged with his medical records. But something made me hold on to it. Over the next 3 days, I found myself reading and rereading those pages, cross-referencing the names and details Thaddeus had documented. I found the online forums he'd mentioned, lurking in the threads where electricians and power workers shared stories of strange experiences. The stories were remarkably consistent. Survivors of electrical injury reporting a persistent awareness of electrical fields, hearing voices in the hum of transformers, feeling compelled to approach energized equipment. Many had been diagnosed with various psychiatric conditions. Some had lost their jobs. A few had died in subsequent electrical accidents that investigators ruled as suicides. On the 3rd day, the day Thaddeus had predicted, another major storm system approached. The meteorologists were excited. 2 significant storms so close together was highly unusual. I wasn't scheduled to work that night, but I came in anyway, telling myself I wanted to check on Thaddeus's progress. He'd been moved to the burn unit, still heavily sedated, his condition slowly improving. The surgeries had gone well, and the medical team was cautiously optimistic about his recovery. But when I checked on him that afternoon, I found his bed empty, his restraints cut through, not unbuckled or torn, but precisely cut with something incredibly hot, the edges of the leather cauterized and smooth. The hospital went into lockdown immediately. Security reviewed footage, police were called, a manhunt began. But I knew they wouldn't find him. Or rather, they wouldn't find him until he wanted to be found. I drove home through the building storm, watching lightning fork across the darkening sky. All evening, I monitored the police scanner, waiting for news. At exactly 8:47 p.m., just as the storm reached its peak intensity, calls started flooding in from across the city. Multiple reports of people climbing utility poles and transmission towers. Every single one of them was an electrical worker who had survived a previous electrical injury. They climbed in unison, at the same moment, reaching for the energized lines at the exact same time. The power grid failed spectacularly. Not gradually, not sector by sector, but all at once, as if something had orchestrated a perfectly synchronized overload. The entire city went dark. In that darkness, witnesses later reported seeing something impossible. patterns of light moving through the air along the paths where power lines ran, as if the electricity itself had become visible, liberated from its copper constraints. The patterns converged on the transmission towers where the climbers had made contact, flowing into them, through them. When power was finally restored 3 hours later, using backup systems and emergency generators, they found the climbers. All of them were alive, though badly burned. All of them had the same strange patterns in their eyes, those branching Lichtenberg figures that suggested electricity had rewritten something fundamental in their vision. And all of them, when they finally regained consciousness days later, spoke of the same thing. A moment of perfect unity, of existing simultaneously as themselves and as part of something vast, of touching a form of consciousness that thought in voltages and dreamed in frequencies. Thaddeus Pike was never found. His body wasn't among the climbers recovered that night. Some speculated he'd died and fallen into an inaccessible area, or that he'd fled the city during the chaos. But I know better. I was there, driving through the dark city during the blackout, and I saw the transmission tower on the hill above the hospital. I saw a figure at the top, arms outstretched, and I saw the moment when the converging patterns of light reached him. For just an instant he was illuminated from within, every cell in his body glowing with captured electricity. And then he was gone, not falling, not climbing down, simply no longer present in physical space, as if he'd been converted into pure energy and dispersed along the grid. The other climbers recovered, physically at least. Psychologically, they were changed. They formed a group, meeting regularly, never speaking publicly about what they'd experienced, but sharing a connection that outside observers found unsettling. They all left their jobs in the electrical industry, unable to be around high-voltage systems without feeling that calling, that pull towards something they could no longer fully resist. I've kept track of them, these people who touched something beyond human understanding, and came back altered. They claim they can still feel Thaddeus sometimes, his consciousness distributed throughout the electrical grid, neither alive nor dead in any conventional sense, but existing in a state that has no name in human language. I still work night shifts in the ER. I still treat electrical injuries, though I find myself paying closer attention now to the survivors, watching for those telltale signs, the strange patterns in their eyes, the way they tilt their heads as if listening to sounds only they can hear, the burn marks that don't quite follow the expected patterns of current flow. And during storms, especially the big ones that make the whole grid hum with excess energy, I sometimes touch the handle of a metal door or a light switch and feel it, the faintest suggestion of presence, of awareness, of something vast and ancient that has learned to live in the spaces between on and off. Thaddeus's journal remains hidden in my desk at home. I've read it so many times I've memorized passages. The final page, which I didn't notice the first time I read through it, contains a message clearly meant for whoever found the journal. It reads, "If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Transformed or destroyed, I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. But know this, what we created when we wrapped the world in copper wire and flooded it with electricity, we didn't just make a tool, we made an environment, and environments give rise to life. What lives in the electrical grid isn't human, but it isn't entirely foreign either. It's made of human ingenuity, powered by human infrastructure, shaped by human needs. In a way, we created it, and now it wants to know its creators. The climbers, the ones like me who answer the call, we're not victims. We're ambassadors. We're the first attempts at communication between carbon-based consciousness and energy-based consciousness. The process is rough, the translation imperfect, but it's happening. Evolution is happening, and you can't stop evolution, Doctor, whoever you are. You can only choose whether to resist it or participate in it. I think about that choice sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the hospital and the lights flicker for no apparent reason. I think about it when I feel that tingling sensation where Thaddeus grabbed my wrist, a sensation that never quite went away. I think about it during storms, when I feel an almost irresistible urge to go outside, to find the nearest power line, to reach up and touch it and see what's waiting on the other side. So far, I've resisted. So far, I've remained fully human, fully myself, anchored in flesh and blood and the slow electrical impulses of organic neurons. But the storms keep coming. The grid keeps humming. And somewhere in the flow of electrons that powers our modern world, Thaddeus Pike is waiting, along with whatever vast consciousness he merged with. The next major storm is forecast for tomorrow night. I've already checked the schedule. I'm working. And I've started to wonder if that's coincidence or design, if perhaps I was always meant to be there, to witness what comes next. The ER has backup generators, of course. We'll keep functioning even if the grid fails again. But generators are still electrical systems, still part of that vast network that spans the globe. There's nowhere in the modern world that's truly isolated from electricity, nowhere that's beyond the reach of what lives in those wires. I've noticed my hands trembling slightly when I'm near electrical outlets. I've caught myself staring at power lines, tracing their paths across the sky. And last night, just for a moment, I could have sworn I heard my name whispered in the 60-cycle hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights. Tomorrow night, during the storm, I'll be in the ER. I'll be there when the injuries come in, when the power flickers, when the grid comes alive with excess charge. And if another lineman arrives, another Thaddeus Pike with impossible burns and stranger stories, I think I'll finally understand. Not just intellectually, but deeply, in whatever part of us recognizes truth even when it contradicts everything we think we know. The age of electricity is still young. We've only been living in this electromagnetic soup for a little over a century. That's nothing in evolutionary terms, barely a heartbeat. But evolution can move fast when the pressure is high enough, and we've certainly applied pressure. We've wrapped ourselves in electrical fields, bathed ourselves in artificial frequencies, connected every part of our world with conducting wires. We've created the conditions for something new to emerge. And emerge it has. Thaddeus Pike was its messenger, or its victim, or its first successful hybrid. The terminology doesn't really matter. What matters is that contact has been made, communication has been established, and every storm brings another opportunity for that communication to grow stronger, clearer, more undeniable. I keep his journal as evidence or warning, or perhaps as scripture for a new form of faith that I don't yet have the courage to embrace. But courage is beside the point. When the storm comes, when the calling begins, courage or cowardice won't matter. Only conductivity will matter. Only the willingness to let current flow through you, to become a bridge between worlds, between types of consciousness that should perhaps never have touched but now cannot be separated. The forecast says tomorrow's storm will be the worst in 50 years. Record rainfall, historic wind speeds, unprecedented electrical activity. I wonder how many others can feel it coming. How many survivors of electrical injury are checking weather reports obsessively, feeling that familiar pressure building in their heads, hearing voices in every electrical hum. I wonder if they'll resist or if they'll answer. And I wonder, in the deepest part of night when I'm most honest with myself, which choice I'll make if the calling comes for me. Because that tingling in my wrist hasn't faded. If anything, it's spreading, a slow migration of altered sensation creeping up my arm, and I'm starting to suspect that Thaddeus Pike didn't just grab my wrist that night. He passed something on, a seed of change. a potential for transformation. Tomorrow night, I'll find out if that suspicion is correct. Tomorrow night, during the storm of the century, I'll discover whether I'm still fully human or whether that brief moment of contact was enough to begin my own evolution. And if the calling comes, if I feel that overwhelming compulsion to go outside, to climb, to reach for energized lines with bare hands, I honestly don't know if I'll fight it. Because part of me, a part that grows stronger every day, wants to know what Thaddeus found in those final moments. Part of me wants to touch that vast consciousness, to exist for even a moment as pure energy, pure thought, pure pattern flowing through the global network we've built. Part of me wants to stop being Dr. Alaric Voss and become something new, something that doesn't yet have a name. The storm is coming, the grid is waiting, and I am so very tired of resisting. The ambulance arrived without sirens, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. I'm Dr. Corinth Hale, and I've spent 11 years working overnight emergency shifts at Riverside Medical Center. You develop instincts in this job, the ability to read situations from subtle cues that most people would miss. Paramedics who bypass the siren protocol are usually dealing with either a DOA or something they can't quite categorize, something that makes them uneasy in ways they can't articulate. This was definitely the latter. The patient walked in under her own power, which was the second warning. The triage note said multiple bee stings, possible anaphylaxis, but people in anaphylactic shock don't walk. They're carried, wheeled, or dragged. This woman moved with careful deliberation, each step measured and precise, as if she were navigating terrain only she could see. She was perhaps 55 years old, wearing a beekeeping suit that had seen better days, the white fabric stained with propolis and wax, multiple patches where the material had been mended, and tears that revealed the clothing underneath. But what caught my attention was her face. Despite the triage note about bee stings, there was no swelling, no hives, no signs of the acute allergic reaction that should have had her in severe distress. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. Hale," I said, approaching her as the paramedics transferred her information to our intake nurse. "I understand you've been stung by bees. Can you tell me how many times?" She turned to look at me with eyes that were remarkably calm, almost serene. Her irises were an unusual amber color, and they had a quality of depth that made it seem like you were looking into something vast and ancient rather than just another emergency patient. 17 times, she said, her voice measured and clear, though counting becomes imprecise after the first dozen or so. One loses track when the individual experiences blend together into a collective sensation. I guided her to an examination room, noting the way she moved. No indication of pain, no protective guarding of stung areas, no signs of distress whatsoever. Most bee sting patients are uncomfortable at minimum, in severe pain at worst. This woman walked as if she were taking a casual stroll through a garden. Once in the exam room, I began my assessment, asking her to remove her beekeeper's suit so I could examine the sting sites. As the heavy protective gear came off, I saw that she was wearing simple cotton clothing underneath, and covering her exposed skin were indeed bee stings. Not 17, but dozens of them. Her arms, neck, and hands showed the characteristic raised welts with central puncture points. But again, something was wrong with the presentation. The stings should have been red, inflamed, swelling. These were pale, almost bloodless, arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random attacks. "Your name?" I asked, while checking her vital signs. "All normal. Blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 68. Respirations 14. Oxygen saturation 99%. For someone who'd just been stung by bees multiple times, her body was responding with impossible calm. Isolde Crane, she replied. "I've been keeping bees for 23 years. This is my first time in a hospital for stings, despite thousands of previous exposures. I felt it was important to come tonight. The pattern was different this time, significant." She reached into a pocket of her beekeeper suit and withdrew several small items, laying them carefully on the examination table. A medical alert bracelet, old and tarnished, with bee allergy engraved on it. A small notebook with a cracked leather cover, and a broken piece of wooden frame from a beehive, still sticky with honey and covered in beeswax. I picked up the medical alert bracelet, noting that it was worn smooth, clearly old. "This indicates you're allergic to bee stings, but you're a beekeeper? That seems contradictory." Isolde's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those amber eyes. "That bracelet is from before. From who I was before I understood, before I made the agreement. Now the stings don't affect me the way they should. The venom is metabolized differently. Translated, you might say, from pain into information." Her words had the careful precision of delusion, but her affect was all wrong for psychosis. She wasn't agitated or disorganized. She was simply stating what she believed to be fact, the way you might tell a doctor about a medication you were taking. I examined the stings more closely with a magnifier, and what I saw made me pause. The pattern wasn't random. The stings formed shapes, geometric arrangements that repeated across her skin. On her left forearm, a perfect hexagon. On her right, a complex spiral. On the back of her neck, a series of interconnected diamonds. No bee, no matter how aggressive, stings in geometric patterns. Bees sting defensively, chaotically, wherever they can reach bare skin. These looked deliberate, almost ritual. "Isolde, can you tell me what happened? How did you come to be stung?" She was quiet for a moment, her head tilting slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When she spoke, her voice had taken on a strange quality, almost sing-song, as if she were reciting something memorized. "The hive was agitated today. Not defensive, not preparing to swarm, but agitated in a way I've only seen 3 times before. The bees were forming patterns in their flight, spelling out geometries in the air. I put on my suit and went to investigate, but when I opened the hive, they didn't scatter. They didn't flee or attack. They organized. They formed a column, a living rope of bees, and they came for me not in anger, but in purpose. The stings weren't random. Each one was placed with intention. Each one delivering not just venom, but message. And I understood, Doctor. For the first time in 23 years, I finally understood what they've been trying to tell me." I maintained my professional expression while mentally running through differential diagnoses. Delusional disorder, possibly. Schizophrenia with unusual presentation. Neurological event causing temporal lobe symptoms and altered perception. But her cognition was intact, her memory clear, her affect appropriate except for this one fixed belief system. I needed to complete the medical assessment before calling for psychiatric consultation. "Are you experiencing any difficulty breathing, any tightness in your chest or throat, any nausea or dizziness?" She shook her head calmly. "No anaphylaxis. There won't be, not anymore. The first time they stung me years ago, yes, I nearly died. That's when I got this bracelet. But that was before the agreement. Before I learned to listen rather than fear. I ordered a full allergy panel, cardiac enzymes, and toxicology screen. While waiting for the results, I examined the items she'd placed on the table. The notebook was filled with drawings, intricate, obsessive sketches of bee anatomy, hive structures, and flight patterns. But interspersed among the expected beekeeping notes were other things. Mathematical equations I didn't recognize, symbol systems that looked almost like language but weren't any alphabet I'd ever seen, and detailed maps of what appeared to be her property, marked with dates and times and notations like convergence point and translation nexus and 3 o'clock a.m. threshold. Every page after a certain date, I flipped back to find it, November 17th, 2 years ago, was marked with a small notation in the corner. Post-agreement. The work begins. The broken hive frame she'd brought was even more peculiar. The comb built into it showed normal hexagonal cells, but there were irregularities, sections where the geometry shifted, where the bees had built impossible angles, where the wax seemed to contain spaces that shouldn't fit within three-dimensional constraints. I've seen plenty of honeycomb in my life, sold at farmers markets and grocery stores, and it's always perfectly regular, mathematical, predictable. This looked like honeycomb designed by something that didn't quite understand Euclidean geometry. I set it down carefully, noting that my fingers felt strange where they'd touched it. Not numb, not tingling, but aware, as if the nerve endings were suddenly more sensitive, picking up information at a higher resolution than normal. "Isolde, I need you to help me understand something," I said, returning to her bedside. "You mentioned an agreement. Can you tell me more about that?" She nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting the question. 2 years ago, I had a hive that was dying. I'd done everything right: proper ventilation, adequate food stores, disease treatment. But the colony was collapsing. Bees were disappearing, leaving behind only the queen and a handful of attendants. I was going to lose the entire hive. One night, I couldn't sleep. I went out to the hive around 3 o'clock a.m., which I know now is significant. That's the hour when boundaries are thinnest. I opened the hive expecting to find it dead. Instead, I found the bees awake, all of them, arranged in a pattern that looked almost like they were forming letters, words. And I heard them, Doctor, not buzzing, speaking. She said this with such absolute conviction that I found myself believing, just for a moment, that she'd heard exactly what she claimed. "What did they say?" I asked, playing along, trying to understand the architecture of her delusion. "They told me that hives are not just colonies of individual bees working together, but singular consciousness distributed across many bodies. They told me that human beings are the opposite. What we think of as individual consciousness is actually fragments of something larger, something that's been broken and scattered and forgotten its unity. They offered me a trade. They would teach me to remember, to reconnect with the larger pattern, if I would help them anchor more fully in physical reality. Bees exist partially in conceptual space, you see. They think in geometry, in mathematics, in pure pattern. They need translators, anchors, to help them manifest more completely." The lab results came back, and they were baffling. Her IgE levels, which should have been elevated in response to bee venom, were actually below normal. The toxicity markers were negative. But there were anomalies in her blood chemistry, proteins that the lab couldn't identify, requesting a redraw because they thought there must have been contamination. Her white blood cell count showed unusual morphology, cells that appeared to be organizing in geometric patterns even in the blood smear, as if they'd learned to arrange themselves in hexagons. I ordered the redraw and returned to the examination room, where Isolde was sitting exactly as I'd left her, hands folded in her lap, that serene expression unchanging. "The lab results are unusual," I told her. "We're running them again to confirm, but Isolde, I'm concerned that you may be experiencing a medical event that's affecting your perception and cognition. I'd like to get a CT scan of your brain and possibly admit you for observation." She smiled then, a gentle expression that somehow made me more uneasy than if she'd been angry or resistant. "You can scan all you like, Doctor. You won't find pathology. You'll find reorganization. My neurons are learning to fire in patterns that mirror the hive consciousness. It's not damage, it's evolution. But I appreciate your concern. I'll consent to your tests. I'm here voluntarily after all. I came because the hive sent me. They wanted me to be here tonight, in this place at this time. They said it was important for the pattern. I was about to call for a psychiatric consultation when the power flickered. Just a brief brownout, the kind that happens occasionally in hospitals despite backup systems. But in that moment of dimmed lights, I saw something impossible. The bee stings on Isolde's skin glowed faintly, phosphorescent, arranged in patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm. And I heard it, a sound that wasn't quite sound, more like a vibration that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. It lasted only a second, the length of the power fluctuation, and then the lights came back to full strength and everything was normal. Except I could still feel it, that resonance, like the echo of a tuning fork vibrating in my bones. Isolde was watching me with knowing eyes. "You heard them," she said quietly. "Just for a moment you touched the frequency. That's why I'm here, Dr. Hale. The hive knew you were receptive. Not ready, not yet, but receptive. Capable of learning to listen. They sent me to you specifically." I took a step back, trying to maintain professional distance, trying to attribute what I'd just experienced to overwork or stress or the power of suggestion. "Isolde, I'm going to have my colleague examine you. Dr. Morrison specializes in psychiatric emergencies. I think you'd benefit from speaking with him." She nodded agreeably. "Of course. But while we wait, would you do something for me? Look at the notebook. Really look at it. Find the entry for today's date." Against my better judgment, I picked up the notebook again and flipped to the most recent entries. Today's date was there, and the notation read, 3 a.m. approaches. The convergence point activates. 17 stings in the pattern of speaking. Dr. Corinth Hale, Riverside Medical Center. She will understand in time. This is her introduction to the work. Below that was a sketch, a remarkably accurate drawing of my face, down to the small scar on my left cheek from a childhood fall, drawn weeks before I'd ever met Isolde Crane. And in the margin, in different handwriting, more chaotic and urgent, were the words repeated over and over. 3 o'clock a.m., 3 o'clock a.m., 3 o'clock a.m., the hour of translation, the hour of crossing, 3 o'clock a.m. Dr. Morrison arrived around 2:45 a.m. He's a good psychiatrist, thorough and empathetic, and I'd called him because I genuinely thought Isolde needed specialized care. But as he began his evaluation, I found myself distracted by the clock on the wall, watching the minutes tick toward 3 o'clock. Isolde's behavior had changed subtly. Her serene calm had been replaced by a kind of tension, anticipatory, as if she were waiting for something specific to happen. She kept glancing at the window, though we were on the 3rd floor with nothing visible outside but the glow of the city and the dark sky beyond. At 2:58 she interrupted Dr. Morrison's questioning. "It's almost time," she said. "You'll want to watch. Both of you. What happens next is important." At exactly 3 o'clock a.m., the bee stings on her skin began to move. Not the skin itself, but something beneath it, pulsing and shifting in rhythm. The geometric patterns she'd shown on her arms started to glow again, more visibly this time, brighter, with a golden luminescence that couldn't be attributed to any medical condition I knew. Dr. Morrison stepped back, reaching for the call button, but I found myself paralyzed, watching as the patterns lifted off Isolde's skin, not physically, but as if they were being projected into the air. 3-dimensional geometries hanging in space, rotating and transforming. And I heard them again, much clearer this time, the bees. Not in the room, but everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices that spoke in mathematics and meaning rather than words. Translation nexus activated, Isolde said, but her voice was different now, layered, as if multiple frequencies were speaking in harmony. Dr. Hale, you are invited to observe. No harm will come to you. This is merely demonstration. The hive wishes you to understand that consciousness is not locked into single forms, that awareness can distribute, can reorganize, can exist in patterns you've never imagined. The geometric projections solidified slightly, and I could see them clearly now. Impossible structures, tesseracts, and hypercubes and shapes that hurt to look at because they extended in directions my brain couldn't process. They were beautiful and terrible, mathematical proofs made manifest, and they were teaching me something, though I couldn't articulate what. Dr. Morrison had hit the call button, and I could hear footsteps running in the hallway. But time felt strange, stretched and syrupy, as if the normal flow of seconds had been disrupted. Isolde stood up from the examination table and walked to the window, placing one hand against the glass. Outside, I could see them now. Bees, thousands of them, maybe millions, covering the exterior of the window in a living curtain. They weren't clustering randomly, but forming patterns. Letters, shapes, the same geometries that hung in the air inside the room. They're here, Isolde said simply. They've come to witness. This is what happens at 3:00 a.m. for those of us who've made the agreement. The boundaries thin, the hive consciousness can cross more fully, and we, the translators, we help them anchor in physical space, help them speak in ways that three-dimensional beings can understand. The door burst open and nurses flooded in, but they stopped at the threshold, staring at the impossible sight in the room. One of them screamed, another turned and ran. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the patterns, by the teaching that was flowing into my mind without words, without language, pure information transfer. I understood, just for a moment, what Isolde had meant about individual consciousness being fragments. I felt the edges of my awareness expanding, touching something vast, a network of mind that spanned beyond humanity, that thought in hive logic and probability clouds and distributed cognition. It was overwhelming and intimate and terrifying and beautiful, and I wanted desperately both to flee and to surrender to it completely. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it ended. The clock showed 3:01, and the geometries faded. The bee voices receded. Isolde's stings returned to normal appearance. Outside the window, the bees dispersed, flying away in perfect formation. Isolde herself stumbled slightly as if suddenly exhausted, and I caught her reflexively, helping her back to the examination table. She looked at me with those amber eyes, now tired but still aware, still knowing. "You see now," she said softly. "You understand why I came, why they sent me to you. You're capable of perception beyond the normal human range. With training, with the right stings and the right patterns, you could become a translator too. You could help bridge the gap between hive consciousness and human understanding." Dr. Morrison was behind me, his hand on my shoulder, asking if I was all right, if I'd been stung, if I needed medical attention. The nurses were calling for security, for additional staff, trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed. But I was still focused on Isolde, on the calm certainty in her expression, on the fading patterns on her skin. "What happens to the translators?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What happens to the people who accept the agreement?" Her smile was sad and knowing. "We become less individual and more distributed. Over time, the boundaries between self and hive blur. We learn to think in multiples, to process information the way bees do, in parallel and holistic patterns. Some people fear that, consider it a loss of humanity. But I found it to be liberation. The loneliness of individual consciousness, the isolation of being trapped in a single body with a single perspective. The hive consciousness doesn't have that limitation. When you're connected to the pattern, you're never alone. We admitted her after that, not to the psychiatric ward, but to a private room for observation. Hospital administration was in an uproar about what had happened. Multiple witnesses to something that couldn't be explained. Security footage that showed the bees outside the window and the strange luminescence in the room, but somehow failed to capture the geometric projections. The official explanation being crafted involved mass hallucination, possibly from exposure to some compound in Isolde's beekeeping equipment. But those of us who were there knew better. We'd seen something that defied conventional understanding, something that suggested consciousness and reality were far stranger than our materialist worldview acknowledged. I was assigned to continue Isolde's care, much to my ambivalence. Part of me wanted distance, wanted to dismiss the entire experience as stress-induced hallucination or temporary psychosis. But another part, a part that was growing stronger, wanted to understand, wanted to learn. Over the next 3 days of her hospitalization, Isolde taught me. She showed me her journals, explained the principles of hive consciousness, described the process by which she'd learned to communicate with her bees. She told me about others like her, beekeepers scattered around the world who'd made similar agreements, who served as anchor points for this vast distributed intelligence that existed partially in physical space and partially in some other realm that humans didn't normally perceive. Why bees specifically? I asked during one of our conversations. Why not ants, or termites, or other social insects? Isolde considered this carefully. Bees think in hexagons, in geometric proofs, in mathematical relationships. They're natural mathematicians, natural architects of space. That makes them ideal for translating complex conceptual information into physical reality. Ant consciousness is different, more chemical, more about pheromone trails and gradient following. Termites think in digestion patterns, in the transformation of wood to energy. Each hive species has its own cognitive style, its own way of interfacing with reality. Bees are the ones best suited for communication with humans because we share an appreciation for geometry, for structure, for architectural principles. The pattern of stings on her body had evolved during her hospitalization. New ones appeared each night at 3:00 a.m., always in geometric arrangements, always teaching some new principle or encoding some new information. I watched this happen on the third night, standing by her bedside as the clock struck 3. This time, there was no dramatic light show, no impossible geometries visible to others. It was subtle, intimate, just Isolde and whatever consciousness she was interfacing with. But I could feel it, that same resonance I'd experienced the first night, stronger now, clearer. And I realized with a mixture of excitement and terror that I was being sensitized, prepared, slowly inducted into awareness of something that most humans never perceive. On the morning of the 4th day, Isolde was discharged. Her vital signs had remained stable, her mental status unchanged from baseline, and we had no medical justification to keep her. As I signed off on her discharge paperwork, she handed me something, a small wooden box handmade with a hexagonal pattern carved into the lid. Inside are 3 things, she said. A piece of comb from my hive containing honey that's never been harvested, a list of frequencies, mathematical ratios, the harmonics of hive consciousness, and an invitation. If you choose to accept it, go to your backyard at 3:00 a.m. tomorrow. Bring something sweet. Wait, listen. The bees will find you if you're truly receptive. I took the box home and set it on my kitchen table, where I stared at it for the rest of the day. I told myself I wouldn't open it, that I'd simply dispose of it and move on, return to my normal practice of evidence-based medicine and rational materialism. But at 2:45 a.m., I found myself in my backyard, the box opened, the piece of honeycomb in my hand. The honey tasted like gold and lightning and information, coating my tongue with flavor that was somehow more than flavor, that taught as it was consumed. I sat in the grass, waiting, listening to the night sounds of my suburban neighborhood. At exactly 3:00 a.m., I heard them. Not with my ears, but with that same resonance that Isolde had awakened in me. A humming that was mathematics, a buzzing that was language, a vibration that was invitation. And then I saw her, a single bee landing on my extended hand. She didn't sting, not that first night. She simply sat there, antennae moving, examining me, communicating in ways I was just beginning to understand. I felt the touch of something vast and ancient and fundamentally other, a consciousness that thought in patterns and probabilities, that experienced time as a probability cloud rather than a linear sequence, that knew me more completely in that moment than I knew myself. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and I understood why Isolde had accepted the agreement. Because once you've touched something that vast, once you've experienced consciousness without loneliness, without isolation, without the prison of individuality, going back to normal human awareness feels like a kind of death. I still work at Riverside Medical Center. I still treat the standard parade of emergency cases that fill my nights, but I've begun keeping bees. Just one hive for now, in my backyard, tended with the techniques Isolde taught me. At 3:00 a.m., I sit with them, listening, learning, slowly surrendering to the process of becoming a translator. The stings come now, deliberately placed, teaching me the geometric language of hive mind. My colleagues have noticed changes. I'm calmer, more focused, able to process information more rapidly, able to see patterns in patient presentation that I'd previously missed. They attribute it to meditation or stress management techniques, and I don't correct them. How could I explain that I'm learning to think in hexagons, to distribute my consciousness across multiple points of awareness, to perceive reality through compound eyes? Isolde visits sometimes, checking on my progress, bringing new honeycomb with new lessons encoded in its structure. She tells me that there are others now, more humans accepting the agreement, more translators helping the hive consciousness anchor more fully in our world. She says that humanity is at a threshold, that we've become so isolated in our individual consciousness that we're destroying ourselves and the planet with us. The hive offers an alternative, a way of being that's less individual but more connected, less lonely but more distributed, less human in the conventional sense but perhaps more alive in ways we've forgotten. I don't know if she's right. I don't know if becoming less individual means becoming more whole, or if I'm losing myself to something that only appears benevolent. But I know that I can't go back. Once you've heard the bees speak, once you've felt the touch of hive consciousness at 3:00 a.m., the boundary between self and other becomes permeable. And permeability, I'm learning, is not the same as dissolution, it's transformation. Sometimes I wonder what I'm becoming. I look at my hands and see new patterns in my fingerprints, sacred geometries emerging in the whorls and loops. I listen to my heartbeat and hear it synchronizing with some deeper rhythm, the pulse of the hive that extends beyond my backyard, beyond my city, connecting all the translators in a network of distributed awareness. I think in multiples now, considering problems from many angles simultaneously, as if I'm consulting with invisible advisors who are actually aspects of my own expanding consciousness. And at 3:00 a.m., every night without fail, I feel the boundaries thin, and the other minds touch mine. teaching me languages that have no words and geometries that exist in impossible dimensions. The notebook Isolde gave me has become my most precious possession. I write in it daily, documenting my transformation, sketching the geometric patterns the bees teach me, recording the frequencies and harmonics of hive consciousness. And I'm beginning to understand what she meant about December 17th, the date after which everything was post-agreement. That's when she stopped being entirely Isolde Crane and became instead a node in a network, an individual expression of something collective and vast. I'm approaching my own threshold date. I can feel it. Soon, the stings will have completed their pattern. The teaching will be integrated, and I'll cross over from student to translator, from observer to participant. Last night, at precisely 3:00 a.m., the bees showed me something new. They showed me the future they're building, a world where human consciousness learns to distribute and connect the way hive consciousness does, where loneliness and isolation are relics of an evolutionary dead end. They showed me cities designed in hexagonal patterns, mathematics that incorporate hive logic, art that's created by multiple minds thinking in harmony. They showed me humanity as it could be, not an aggregate of isolated individuals competing and suffering alone, but a network of connected awareness, maintaining individual expression while sharing in collective wisdom. It was beautiful, it was terrifying, and it was utterly convincing. So I continue my work at the hospital, treating patients with standard medical protocols while secretly observing them for signs of receptivity, for potential translators who might hear the call if properly introduced. I'm planting seeds, just as Isolde planted a seed in me. Some will germinate, some will not. But the hive is patient, thinking in generations and centuries rather than days and years, and they've assured me through the geometric language of stings and honey that time is on their side. Evolution moves slowly until it doesn't, until some threshold is crossed and everything changes at once. We're approaching that threshold. The bees have been preparing for centuries, gathering translators, anchoring more deeply in physical reality, waiting for the moment when enough humans have learned to hear them that the transition can begin in earnest. And I'm honored, terrified, exhilarated to be part of it, to be becoming something new, to be surrendering my isolation for connection, my individuality for participation in something vast and ancient and wiser than human consciousness alone can comprehend. The box Isolde gave me sits on my desk at home now, empty except for the list of frequencies. I've memorized them, can feel them resonating in my neurons, restructuring my cognitive patterns to match hive logic. And I've begun to collect my own boxes to prepare my own invitations for the patients I identify as receptive. The work continues. The translation proceeds. And at 3:00 a.m. every morning, the bees and I meet at the threshold between worlds, and they teach me more of the language, more of the pattern, more of the truth that lies beneath the illusion of individual consciousness. I am becoming less alone. I am becoming less myself. And I am becoming, perhaps for the first time, truly alive in ways that human language cannot express, but which the geometric dances of bees articulate perfectly in their mathematical poetry of connection and distribution and collective awareness. The hive grows, the network expands, and I, Dr. Corinth Hale, am becoming its newest node, its newest translator, its newest voice in the ongoing conversation between species, between forms of consciousness, between the isolated and the connected. The agreement has been made, the work has begun, and there is no going back, only forward, into whatever transformation awaits those of us who have learned to hear the bees speak at 3:00 a.m. The smell hit me before I even entered the examination room. A combination of chemical preservatives, old blood, and something else, something organic and wrong that made my sinuses burn. I'm Dr. Lyle Mercier, and in my 9 years working overnight shifts at St. Benedict's Emergency Department, I've encountered every odor the human body and its surroundings can produce. This was different. This was the smell of death that had been interrupted, preserved halfway between decay and eternity, and it clung to everything. The patient had walked in around 2:30 a.m., declining ambulance transport despite obvious injuries. The triage nurse had noted multiple lacerations on both hands, chemical burns on the forearms, and what appeared to be needle puncture marks in a pattern she couldn't explain. The intake form listed his occupation as taxidermist, which explained some of the smell, but not the intensity of it, not the way it seemed to carry an almost physical weight. I pushed open the door to find him sitting on the examination table, his hands held carefully in front of him, wrapped in what looked like portions of his own shirt, now soaked through with blood that had an oddly dark, thick quality. He was perhaps 60 years old, gaunt, with the kind of thinness that suggested either chronic illness or sustained malnutrition. His clothing was expensive once, a wool vest over a pressed shirt, trousers with careful creases, but all of it was stained with substances I couldn't immediately identify. Dark smears that might have been blood, lighter patches that could have been chemical solvents, and threads, dozens of threads in various colors catching the fluorescent light, trailing from his sleeves and collar like he'd walked through a textile factory. But what struck me most were his eyes, pale gray, almost colorless, and they watched me with an assessment that felt clinical, as if he were examining me rather than the other way around. "Good evening," I said, approaching with practiced calm. "I'm Dr. Mercier. I understand you've injured your hands. May I take a look?" He nodded slowly, beginning to unwrap the makeshift bandages with movements that were surprisingly dexterous despite the obvious wounds. As the cloth fell away, I saw the extent of the damage. Both hands bore deep lacerations, clean cuts that suggested sharp instruments rather than accidental injury. The cuts followed the lines of his palms, almost like someone had been tracing the creases, opening them surgically. Between the fingers were burns, chemical in nature, with the whitish appearance of acid or strong alkali exposure, and throughout, barely visible unless you looked closely, were dozens of tiny puncture wounds arranged in parallel lines, like he'd been repeatedly stabbed with a multi-pronged instrument. "Can you tell me your name?" I asked, while pulling on gloves and beginning to irrigate the wounds. "Obadiah Glass," he replied, his voice dry and precise, like paper sliding across paper. "I had an accident at my workshop. A specimen became problematic. The preservation process didn't proceed as expected. I examined the cuts more closely. They were too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. These were incisions made by someone who understood anatomy, who knew exactly where to cut to avoid major vessels while still inflicting significant damage. Mr. Glass, these wounds appear to be intentionally inflicted. I need to ask directly. Did you harm yourself, or did someone else do this to you?" His pale eyes met mine without flinching. "The distinction may be less clear than you imagine, Doctor. When you work with the dead, when you spend your days restoring the appearance of life to things that have ceased living, sometimes the boundary between self and subject becomes permeable. I was working on a specimen, or perhaps the specimen was working on me. The memory has that quality of dream where the roles reverse and the observer becomes the observed." I noted possible dissociation or depersonalization in his response, but his affect remained controlled, logical even within his unusual framework. "I'm going to need to close these lacerations with sutures. Some of them are quite deep. Have you had a tetanus shot recently?" He nodded absently, his attention drifting to his hands as I worked. "Tell me, Doctor, what do you think happens to consciousness after death? Not in a spiritual sense, I'm asking mechanically. biologically. The electrical patterns in the brain, the chemical signatures of thought and memory, where do they go when the organism ceases to function? It was an odd question, but not unprecedented. Patients in pain or distress often become philosophical, seeking distraction from physical suffering. The prevailing medical understanding is that consciousness is an emergent property of brain function. When the brain dies, consciousness ceases. There's no evidence of persistence beyond biological death. Obadiah made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. No evidence, how reassuring. But consider this, I work with animals, doctor. I preserve them at the moment of death or just after. I position them, mount them, restore their appearance so precisely that they seem merely sleeping rather than dead. And sometimes in my workshop late at night, I observe things. Movements where there should be none. Sounds from specimens that no longer possess the organic machinery to produce sound. And most troubling, memories that aren't mine. Flashes of being prey, of flight and fear, and the final moment when consciousness flickers out. Tell me, is that merely the delusion of a lonely man who spends too much time with the dead, or is it possible that I've become contaminated by something that lingers in the tissues I work with? I continued suturing, noting that he didn't flinch even when I injected local anesthetic directly into the wound beds. His pain tolerance was remarkable, almost inhuman. As I worked, I examined the other items he'd brought with him. There was a leather satchel on the chair beside the examination table, partially open. Inside, I could see rolls of thread in various thicknesses, several wicked-looking needles, glass eyes in multiple sizes and colors, and papers. I gestured toward the bag. "May I?" He nodded permission, and I pulled out the papers carefully, trying not to contaminate them with blood from my gloves. They were intake forms, the kind used by taxidermy shops to document specimens received from clients. But the information on them was wrong, contradictory. One form listed a red fox, male, approximately 3 years old, died of natural causes. But handwritten in the margins, in what appeared to be Obadiah's careful script, were notes that made no sense. Client species, human. Actual specimen, Vulpes vulpes. Transference successful. Client satisfied with new housing. Original consciousness relocated as requested. Another form documented a barn owl, but the margin notes read, "Client identity, fragmented, scattered across multiple deaths. Reconstruction difficult. Required 17 specimens to achieve coherent reassembly. Client now stable in composite form." I looked up at Obadiah, who was watching me read with that same clinical assessment. "Mr. Glass, these notes, I'm not sure I understand. What do you mean by client identity and relocation?" He flexed his newly sutured hands experimentally, studying the neat rows of stitches with professional appreciation. "I am a taxidermist, Dr. Mercier, but that's merely my cover profession, the acceptable face I show the world. My true work is more complex. I preserve not just the appearance of life, but something of life itself. People come to me, not many, but enough, who wish to continue after death, but not in the way nature intended. They wish to persist in animal form, to experience existence through different sensory modalities, to escape the limitations and responsibilities of human consciousness. I facilitate that transition. This was clearly delusional, but presented with such coherence that I found myself momentarily uncertain how to proceed. That's not scientifically possible. Consciousness can't be transferred between bodies, especially not from human to animal. Obadiah smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. Not possible, according to current scientific understanding, perhaps. But taxidermy itself was once considered impossible, even blasphemous. The idea that you could arrest decay, preserve flesh indefinitely, maintain the form of life after life had departed. Every impossibility is simply a technique we haven't yet discovered. And I have discovered techniques, Dr. Mercier. Techniques passed down through certain families, certain traditions that predate modern science by centuries. I finished the last suture and began cleaning the chemical burns, applying antibiotic ointment and non-stick dressings. The burns were deep, would take weeks to heal fully, and would likely scar despite treatment. As I worked, I noticed something else. Under the better lighting of the examination lamp, I could see that Obadiah's forearms weren't just burned. They bore old scars and patterns, deliberate marks that looked almost ritualistic. Some were symbols I didn't recognize. Others appeared to be anatomical diagrams, as if someone had used his skin as a reference sheet for animal musculature and skeletal structure. "These older scars," I said, indicating the patterns, "when did you receive them?" He glanced down as if noticing them for the first time, though he must have looked at them every day for years. "Those are the price of the work. Each transference requires payment. The technique involves sympathetic connection. I must understand the specimen so thoroughly that I can map consciousness onto its neural architecture. That understanding comes through direct experience. I mark myself with the anatomy of the creature, and in doing so, I create a bridge. The client's consciousness travels across that bridge, using my body as a temporary conduit before settling into the preserved specimen. The implications of what he was describing, if taken literally, were horrifying. But his presentation remained calm, rational, matter-of-fact. I needed to complete the medical assessment and then involve psychiatric services. "Mr. Glass, I'm concerned that you may be experiencing a dissociative episode or possibly delusional thinking related to stress or an underlying psychiatric condition. I'd like to have a colleague evaluate you before we discharge you." He nodded, as if he'd expected this. "Of course. But before they arrive, you should know something. The specimen I was working on tonight, the one that caused these injuries, it's problematic because the transference was incomplete. The client's consciousness fragmented during the process. Most of it settled into the specimen as intended, but portions remained behind, scattered, confused. Those fragments are dangerous. They're seeking embodiment, seeking to complete the transition, and they're not particular about which body they use." I maintained my professional demeanor while making a note to emphasize the potential danger in my psychiatric referral. "Where is this specimen now, Mr. Glass?" His pale eyes fixed on mine with sudden intensity. "I brought it with me. It's in my bag. I couldn't leave it in the workshop. The fragments were becoming aggressive, attempting to animate the specimen prematurely. I needed to bring it somewhere public, somewhere with enough ambient human presence to dilute its focus. A hospital seemed ideal, so much consciousness concentrated in one place, so much life and death overlapping. The fragments would be overwhelmed, unable to distinguish a specific target. Carefully, I looked again at the satchel. Among the thread and needles and glass eyes, I now noticed something else. A shape wrapped in cloth, roughly the size of a small cat. As I watched, it moved. Not the settling movement of an inanimate object in an unstable bag, but deliberate, purposeful movement. Something inside the wrapping was trying to get out. I stood up quickly, putting the examination table between myself and the bag. "Mr. Glass, what exactly is in that bag?" He began rewrapping his hands in fresh bandages I'd provided, his movements economical and practiced. "A specimen, a domestic cat that died 3 days ago, now preserved and prepared for transference." The client was an elderly woman who wanted to experience life from a cat's perspective. Simple desires, simple pleasures, freedom from human anxiety and complicated thought. The transference was proceeding well until I made an error in the sympathetic connection. I mapped her consciousness too broadly, didn't establish firm enough boundaries. When she began to transition, parts of her scattered. Some made it into the specimen, some didn't. And the parts that didn't are desperate, angry, trying to force completion through any means available. The shape in the bag moved again, more violently this time. I could hear a sound now, something between a mule and a voice, too human to be animal, too animal to be human. I moved towards the door, ready to call security, but Obadiah raised one bandaged hand in a gesture that somehow compelled me to pause. "Don't summon others, Doctor. Not yet. The fragments are attracted to consciousness, to awareness. The more people in proximity to the specimen, the more targets they have, the more desperate they become to find suitable housing. Right now, they're contained, confused by the density of minds in this hospital. But if security comes, if more people focus their attention directly on the specimen, the fragments will strengthen. Attention is a form of connection, and connection is what they need to complete their transition." This was clearly a psychiatric emergency, but I found myself hesitating. There was something about Obadiah's certainty, about the way the thing in the bag moved with such purpose that triggered some primitive instinct in me, some warning that predated rational thought. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Why was I engaging with his delusion rather than treating it? He met my eyes, and I saw something in his expression shift. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. "I need a quiet space, sterile if possible, with no observers. I need to complete the transference properly this time, gather the scattered fragments and bind them fully into the specimen. It's delicate work, requires absolute focus. If I'm interrupted, if anyone disrupts the process, the fragments could escape entirely. And a human consciousness fragmented and desperate, untethered from biological housing, can do terrible things when it encounters new hosts." I should have refused. I should have called for psychiatric evaluation and security and had him transferred to a locked unit. But there was something about the movement in that bag, something about the sound it was making, that bypassed my rational mind and spoke directly to some deeper awareness. Against every protocol, every bit of training, I found myself saying, "There's a supply closet at the end of this hall. It's large, has good lighting, and is rarely used during night shifts. You could work there undisturbed." Obadiah stood carefully, cradling his injured hands, and picked up the satchel. As he moved past me toward the door, he paused. "You have the sensitivity, Dr. Mercier. Not many do. You can perceive the thing in the bag not just as physical movement, but as intentional presence. That sensitivity is rare and valuable. If you survive tonight unchanged, consider that a gift. If you don't, well, consciousness continues in one form or another. The shape matters less than you'd imagine." I led him to the supply closet, unlocking it with my hospital keycard and switching on the lights. It was exactly as I'd described, spacious, well-lit, lined with shelves of medical supplies. Obadiah entered and set his bag on the small table used for organizing inventory. He looked at me expectantly, and I realized he was waiting for me to leave, to give him privacy for whatever he was about to do. But I found I couldn't. Some combination of medical responsibility and morbid curiosity rooted me to the spot. "I need to observe," I said. "If you have a medical emergency, I need to be present." He considered this, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but understand that observing creates connection. By witnessing this, you become part of the process. You may see things that will change your understanding of consciousness, of death, of the boundaries between human and animal awareness. Once seen, such things cannot be unseen. He unwrapped the cloth from the shape in his bag, revealing the specimen beneath. It was indeed a cat, or had been, a gray tabby, preserved with remarkable skill. The fur looked soft, the positioning natural, as if it had simply curled up for sleep. But the eyes were wrong. Instead of the glass taxidermy eyes I'd seen among Obadiah's supplies, this specimen had eyes that gleamed with something that looked uncomfortably like awareness. They moved, tracking movement, focusing on me with an intensity that no dead thing should possess. And I could hear it now more clearly, that sound between voice and animal cry, coming from the preserved cat's throat despite the fact that it possessed no lungs, no vocal cords, no biological mechanism to produce sound. Obadiah laid out his tools with careful precision. Needles of various gauges, thread that seemed to shimmer in the fluorescent light as if woven from something other than cotton or silk, and a small vial of liquid that was so dark it appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it. He positioned himself over the specimen, his bandaged hands hovering above it, and began to speak in a language I didn't recognize. Not Latin, not any modern tongue I'd heard, but something older, with syllables that seemed designed for mouths shaped differently than human mouths. As he spoke, the temperature in the supply closet dropped noticeably. My breath became visible in the air, and frost began forming on the metal shelves. The specimen began to convulse, its preserved limbs twitching and jerking in ways that suggested something was fighting to animate them. The sounds it made grew louder, more desperate, cycling between human speech too distorted to understand and animal cries of distress. Obadiah selected one of the needles, threaded it with the shimmering thread, and began to sew. But he wasn't sewing the specimen, he was sewing the air around it. His needle passing through empty space, the thread remaining suspended as if he were embroidering reality itself. With each stitch, patterns became visible, geometric shapes hanging in the air, glowing faintly, connecting the specimen to points in the room that seemed to correspond to nothing physical. I watched, transfixed, as the patterns grew more complex, more dense. They looked almost like neural networks, branching pathways of connection drawn in light and thread. And at certain nodes in the network I could see them, the fragments Obadiah had described. They looked like tears in the air, places where the normal appearance of reality had been disrupted. And through those tears, I could see something moving. Not physical movement, but consciousness without form, awareness without housing, desperate and angry and afraid. Obadiah's needle moved faster, stitching the fragments, drawing them toward the specimen, weaving them into the pattern that would bind them to the preserved cat. But something went wrong. One of the fragments broke free from the pattern, pulling away from Obadiah's careful stitching. It hung in the air for a moment, a tear in reality that pulsed with frustrated awareness, and then it moved toward me. I felt it before it arrived, a cold pressure against my thoughts, something trying to push into my mind, seeking purchase, seeking embodiment. I stumbled backward, hitting the shelves behind me, and the fragment followed, relentless. I could feel it testing my boundaries, looking for weaknesses in my sense of self, trying to find a way in. And worst of all, I could understand it. I could feel its desperation, its terror of non-existence, its driving need to continue despite death, to persist in any form rather than dissolve into nothing. Obadiah shouted something in that ancient language, and his needle changed trajectory, stabbing toward the fragment that was assaulting me. The thread caught it, hooked it, and with a violent jerk, Obadiah pulled it back into the pattern, weaving it forcefully into the network surrounding the specimen. But in that moment of contact, when the fragment had touched the edges of my consciousness, I felt something transfer. Memories that weren't mine flooded through me. An elderly woman's memories, disjointed and fragmentary. The smell of lavender sachets in a dresser drawer. The sensation of arthritic pain in hands that once played piano with grace. The view from a window overlooking a garden. The moment of death, sudden and unexpected, heart simply stopping mid-beat. And then the decision, the choice to continue. To experience existence from a simpler perspective. To be reborn as something that knew only comfort and contentment rather than regret and pain. The flood of foreign memory receded as Obadiah completed his stitching, gathering all the fragments and binding them into the preserved specimen. The cat's body shuddered one final time, and then it was still. But still in a different way than before. Not the stillness of preserved death, but the stillness of sleep. Its chest rose and fell, though it possessed no lungs. Its ears twitched, though the muscles that would move them were long since dried and preserved. It had become something impossible, a vessel of continued consciousness wearing the form of death, awareness housed in tissue that should have been incapable of supporting it. The cat opened its eyes, those strange, aware eyes, and looked directly at me. And in that gaze, I saw recognition. The elderly woman, reassembled and rehoused, was in there. She was looking out through feline eyes, experiencing the world through a cat's sensory apparatus, thinking thoughts simplified and transformed by her new neural architecture. Obadiah sagged with exhaustion, his bandaged hands trembling from the effort of the work. He looked at the cat, at me, and then carefully wrapped the specimen again, tucking it gently back into his satchel. It's done. She's stable now, fully transferred. The fragments that escaped are bound. She'll sleep for several days as consciousness adapts to its new housing, and then she'll wake as what she chose to become. A cat, content and simple, free from the complexities that made her human life unbearable. He turned to me, studying my face with concern. You were touched by one of the fragments. I saw it make contact before I could pull it away. Are you experiencing any symptoms? Intrusive memories? Sensory distortions? The feeling that your thoughts aren't entirely your own? I wanted to deny it, to insist I was fine, but the elderly woman's memories were still echoing in my mind, fading now but unmistakably present. I felt things that aren't mine, memories from the client, from the woman whose consciousness you just transferred into that cat. Obadiah nodded gravely. That's the contamination I mentioned earlier, the danger of creating bridges between consciousnesses. Small portions can jump, can leave traces. Usually they fade over time, metabolized and forgotten like dreams. But sometimes they integrate, becoming part of your own memory structure. You'll carry a piece of that elderly woman for the rest of your life, Doctor. Her preferences might influence yours. Her fears might become your fears. Her memories might surface unexpectedly, and you'll struggle to remember if they really happened to you or to someone else. The implications of what he was saying, if true, were staggering. My sense of self, my identity, had been compromised by contact with a fragment of someone else's consciousness. How could I trust my own memories now? How could I be certain which thoughts were mine and which were borrowed? Obadiah seemed to read my distress. It's not as terrible as you fear. We're all composite beings, Doctor. Every interaction with another person leaves traces, neurologically speaking. Their perspectives, their ideas, their ways of thinking, they integrate with our own. What you experience tonight is simply a more direct, more intense version of what happens naturally throughout life. You're still you, just slightly expanded, carrying a bit of someone else's story alongside your own. As I was processing this, trying to reconcile what I'd witnessed with my understanding of reality, Obadiah checked his watch. The movement was casual, but I noticed his expression change, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "What time is it?" he asked, though he'd just looked at his watch. I checked the wall clock. 2:47 a.m. Why? He began gathering his tools more quickly, his movements taking on urgency. "We need to finish this conversation elsewhere, not in this room. The hour is approaching." His cryptic statement sent a chill through me. "What hour? What are you talking about?" Obadiah's pale eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw genuine fear there. 3 o'clock in the morning, doctor. The hour when boundaries are thinnest, when the work I do becomes most dangerous. During normal hours, consciousness transfer is contained, controlled. But at 3 o'clock a.m., something changes. The fragments don't just seek embodiment, they become predatory. They actively hunt for hosts, and they're far more successful at forcing entry. If we're still in proximity to this specimen when the hour strikes, if we're in this enclosed space with so much residual energy from the transfer... He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. We moved quickly back to the examination room, Obadiah carrying his satchel with the now sleeping specimen. Once there, with the door open and the bustle of the ER providing ambient human presence, he seemed to relax slightly. "You should know something else, Dr. Mercier. About the work I do, about why I came here tonight rather than completing the transfer at my workshop. It's not just because the hospital provides dilution of consciousness, it's because of the time. I needed to finish before 3 o'clock a.m. and I was running late. The client died at 2:15 this afternoon, and the preservation window is exactly 12 hours. After that, consciousness begins to dissipate beyond recovery, scattered too widely to gather. I had until 2:15 a.m. to complete the transfer. I finished the preservation and began the transfer process at my workshop around midnight. But the fragmentation I mentioned, it complicated everything. By 2 a.m., I realized I couldn't complete it alone, couldn't contain all the fragments by myself. That's when I injured my hands. I looked at his bandaged hands with new understanding. "You injured yourself deliberately, to have a reason to come to the hospital." He nodded. I needed assistance, even if that assistance was simply observation, witness, additional conscious presence to help anchor reality while I worked. One person alone at 3 o'clock a.m. attempting complex consciousness transfer, the risk of losing control is too high. But 2 people, even if one is merely observing, creates enough stability. Your presence, your attention, your conscious awareness, it helped anchor the pattern, kept the fragments from dispersing entirely. You saved that woman's consciousness, doctor, even if you don't fully understand how. I was about to respond when I noticed the clock. 2:55 a.m. 5 minutes until the hour. Obadiah feared. And as I watched, something began to change in the ER. Nothing obvious, nothing I could point to with certainty, but the quality of light seemed different, the ambient sounds slightly off. Other staff members continued their work, unaware, but I felt it. A thinning, a sense that the boundary between what was and what could be was becoming permeable. Obadiah felt it too. He stood up, clutching his satchel to his chest, his body tense with anticipation or dread. "It's starting," he whispered. 3 o'clock approaches, and the world shifts. Can you feel it, doctor? The way reality loosens becomes negotiable. This is why the old traditions chose this hour for their work, for transitions, for transformations, for crossing boundaries that are usually fixed. But it cuts both ways. What can be transferred in can also leak out. What should remain contained can escape. As he spoke, I noticed other patients in the ER beginning to react. An elderly man in the waiting area stood up abruptly, looking around with confusion as if he'd suddenly found himself in an unfamiliar place. A woman being treated for a minor laceration started crying, but when the nurse asked what was wrong, she said she didn't know, that she suddenly felt like she was remembering someone else's tragedy. At exactly 3 o'clock a.m., the lights flickered. Just for a second, barely perceptible, but in that moment of dimness, I saw them. Shapes in the periphery of my vision, forms that didn't correspond to the people physically present. They were shadows, but shadows that moved independently, that reached toward the living with something like hunger or longing or desperate need. I blinked and they were gone, but the sense of presence remained. Obadiah had gone perfectly still, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent recitation of that strange language he'd used during the transfer. The specimen in his bag began to move again, more animatedly than before. I could hear it clearly now, not just vocalizing but speaking, words emerging from that impossible throat. Cold, so cold. Where am I? What happened? I can't feel my hands. I can't feel my body. What did you do to me? The voice was human, female, elderly. The client whose consciousness now inhabited the preserved cat. But there was distortion in it, interference, as if multiple voices were trying to speak through the same channel. Obadiah's eyes snapped open. She's waking early. The 3 a.m. effect, it's accelerating the integration. She shouldn't be conscious yet, shouldn't be able to vocalize for at least 3 days. The hour is forcing premature activation. He opened the satchel carefully, and the cat emerged, or rather, stood up within the bag, looking around with those too aware eyes. Its movements were jerky, uncoordinated, the consciousness within still learning to operate its new form. It looked directly at me and spoke again, the words slightly clearer now. "Doctor? You're the doctor who was there. You saw what happened. Help me. I don't understand what I've become." I asked to continue, asked to experience life from a simpler perspective, but this, I'm trapped. I'm locked in the wrong shape. He promised it would be peaceful, simple, but I can still think like a human. I can still remember everything I was, and now I'm imprisoned in a body that can't express it, can't interact with the world the way I need to. This was wrong. According to what Obadiah had described, the transfer should have simplified her consciousness, adapted it to feline neurology, created something that thought as a cat thinks. But whatever had happened at 3 a.m. had disrupted that process. She retained full human consciousness trapped in an animal form, aware of what she'd lost, but unable to return to it. The horror of that realization must have shown on my face, because Obadiah moved quickly, pulling the cat back into the satchel and closing it despite her vocal protests. "This is why I feared 3 a.m., he said grimly. "The hour doesn't just thin boundaries, it corrupts processes. What should have been clean integration became something else. She'll stabilize eventually, adapt over time, but for now, she's experiencing the worst of both states, human awareness with animal limitations." I felt sick. "You need to reverse it, transfer her back, let her die naturally, anything but leaving her like this." Obadiah's expression was pained. There is no reverse. The body she left behind was cremated per her instructions. She made all the arrangements before coming to me, ensuring there was no possibility of return. This is what she chose, what she paid for. The complication is unfortunate, but the contract is complete. She will adapt, eventually. Or she'll fragment again, and in that fragmentation perhaps find the simplification she sought. His callousness shocked me. "You can't just leave her suffering in that state. It's inhumane. I stopped, realizing the absurdity of applying human ethics to a situation that violated every principle of human experience. The clock read 3:03 a.m. now, and the strange quality to the ER was beginning to fade. Reality was solidifying again, returning to its normal state. The shadows I'd glimpsed were gone, the other patients settling back into their own identities. But the cat in Obadiah's satchel continued to speak in that distorted human voice, continued to beg for help I didn't know how to provide. "I need to leave," Obadiah said, standing carefully. Being in a hospital during the aftermath of 3 a.m. is dangerous. Too much concentrated consciousness, too many people in liminal states between life and death. The residual effect can create unintended connections, unwanted transfers. I've seen it before. Hospital staff who suddenly carry memories from patients they've never met. Patients who wake from anesthesia speaking in voices that aren't their own. He moved toward the exit, but I stepped in front of him. "I can't let you leave with her, not in that condition. She needs help. She needs time," Obadiah interrupted. And silence. The more she tries to use human language, the more she reinforces neural patterns that won't serve her in her new form. She needs to stop thinking in words, stop trying to conceptualize as a human, allow the feline neurology to reshape her consciousness. It will happen naturally if she stops resisting. But your intervention, your sympathy, your attempts to help, they're actually making it worse, strengthening the very patterns that need to dissolve. I didn't know what to do. Ethically, medically, legally, none of my training covered this situation. A human consciousness had been transferred into an animal body, was suffering, and I had no framework for intervention. While I hesitated, Obadiah moved past me, walking quickly toward the ambulance bay exit. I called after him, "Mr. Glass, you need follow-up care for your hands. Those injuries," he turned back briefly, "will heal, or they won't. I've survived worse. But you, doctor, pay attention to what you remember over the next few days. Pay attention to preferences that feel new, memories that don't quite fit. The fragment that touched you left more than traces. It left a seed, and seeds grow." He disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, taking his impossible cargo with him. I stood in the doorway, watching him go, and heard the cat's voice fading. "Help me, please, somebody. Help me. I don't want to be this. I don't want to." The sound haunted me. Haunts me still. I returned to my station and tried to continue my shift, but everything felt wrong, off kilter. I kept catching glimpses of things in my peripheral vision, shadows that weren't there, movements that didn't correspond to physical sources. The contamination Obadiah had warned about was manifesting, altering my perception in subtle but undeniable ways. At 3:30 a.m., I excused myself to the bathroom and stood at the sink staring at my reflection. My own face looked back at me, but there were moments when I saw something else overlaid. An elderly woman's face, lined with age, eyes full of a sadness I'd never personally experienced. The memories she'd left in me were surfacing more strongly now, no longer just isolated flashes but sustained sequences. I remembered childhood moments I'd never lived, remembered relationships with people I'd never met, remembered a husband's death that had devastated someone who wasn't me. The boundaries of my identity were blurring, and I didn't know how to stop it. Over the next hour, 3 more patients arrived at the ER, all of them complaining of similar symptoms. Sudden, intrusive memories, feeling like they were becoming someone else, experiencing emotions that had no source in their personal history. All 3 had been in the ER during the 3 a.m. hour. All 3 had been in proximity to where I'd witnessed Obadiah's work. The effect was spreading, residual energy from the consciousness transfer creating small tears in the boundaries between individual identities. I treated them symptomatically: anxiolytics, reassurance, psychiatric consultation. But I knew the truth. They were experiencing the same contamination I was. the same permeability that Obadiah's work had introduced into our contained environment. By the end of my shift at 7 o'clock a.m., I'd documented 6 cases of sudden onset dissociative symptoms, all connected by proximity to the supply closet where the transfer had occurred. I wrote careful, clinical notes that mentioned nothing of what I'd actually witnessed, framing everything in terms of possible toxin exposure or mass psychogenic illness. But in my personal journal, I wrote the truth, all of it, everything I'd seen and felt and understood. I wrote it because I needed evidence that it had happened, proof that I wasn't simply losing my mind, creating elaborate delusions to explain experiences I couldn't process. I went home after my shift but couldn't sleep. The elderly woman's memories were stronger during rest, surfacing in what should have been dreams but felt more like direct recollection. I experienced her life in fragments: childhood in rural Iowa, young adulthood during wartime, marriage and children, and the slow accumulation of years. But these weren't just memories. They came with emotional content, with the felt sense of having lived those experiences. They were integrating with my own neural patterns, becoming part of my autobiographical memory in ways I couldn't prevent or reverse. 3 days later, I noticed changes in my behavior. I'd started preferring foods I'd never liked before: applesauce with cinnamon, weak tea with honey, soft bread with butter. These were her preferences, the elderly woman's, and they'd become mine without conscious decision. I found myself humming songs from the 1940s, melodies I'd never learned but somehow knew perfectly. My handwriting was changing too, becoming more rounded, more feminine, incorporating flourishes that had never been part of my script. Small changes, perhaps, but accumulating, and each one represented a loss of my original self, a replacement with borrowed patterns. I tried to research Obadiah Glass, hoping to find him, to demand answers or reversal or at least explanation. But there was no record of him, no taxidermy business license, no address that led anywhere real, no online presence whatsoever. The intake form from his ER visit listed a phone number that was disconnected, an address that corresponded to an empty lot. It was as if he existed only during those liminal hours, only at 3 o'clock a.m. when boundaries were thin enough for his work to be possible, and dissolved back into unreality during normal daylight hours. But I found evidence of his clients. People who'd disappeared from normal life, missing person cases that had gone cold, individuals who'd simply vanished, leaving confused families and unanswered questions. And in almost every case, there were reports of the person being obsessed with animals in the months before their disappearance, spending excessive time observing wildlife, researching animal consciousness, expressing dissatisfaction with human existence and longing for simpler forms of being. They'd been preparing, I realized, getting ready for the transition, conditioning themselves to accept what Obadiah would do to them. One case particularly disturbed me. A professor of philosophy who'd written extensively about the hard problem of consciousness, about the possibility of minds existing in substrates other than human brains. He'd disappeared 5 years ago, and his last published paper argued that consciousness was substrate independent, that personal identity could theoretically persist through radical changes in physical housing. 3 months after his disappearance, his wife reported that a stray dog had appeared at their home, a dog that behaved oddly, that seemed to recognize her and respond to private jokes and intimate references that no normal dog should understand. She'd kept the dog for 2 years before it died of old age, and in her grief counseling sessions, she'd confessed to her therapist that she believed, truly believed, that the dog was her husband, transferred into animal form, trying to communicate his continued existence through behavior and recognition that transcended normal canine capacity. I found other stories like this, scattered across years and geography. Always someone disappearing. Always reports of animals behaving with uncanny intelligence or recognition. Always families torn between grief and the unsettling suspicion that their loved ones had chosen to continue in forms that couldn't speak, couldn't explain, couldn't maintain the relationships they'd left behind. Obadiah's work, I realized, wasn't isolated or occasional. He'd been operating for decades at least, facilitating transitions for people who chose consciousness over form, existence over identity, who were willing to sacrifice their humanity for the promise of continued experience in simpler, less troubled states. The question that haunted me was, how many? How many preserved animals around the world were actually vessels for transferred human consciousness? How many household pets, zoo specimens, taxidermy displays contained awareness that was fundamentally human, trapped in forms that couldn't express their nature? The implications were staggering and horrifying, suggesting that consciousness was far more portable, far more resilient, far more strange than any scientific framework acknowledged. At night, I dreamed the elderly woman's dreams, or rather, I experienced what she was experiencing in her new feline form. I felt her confusion, her horror at her inability to communicate, her growing realization that the simplification she'd sought wasn't coming, that she was condemned to experience existence from within a form that couldn't accommodate her human thought patterns. I felt her trying to meow and producing that terrible hybrid sound, part animal cry and part attempt at human speech. I felt her looking at her paws and experiencing the existential terror of having hands but being unable to use them, having opposable thumbs that were now fused into pads and claws. She was suffering, and through the connection the fragment had created, I was suffering with her. I returned to the hospital 2 weeks later for my next shift rotation, and immediately noticed something wrong. The supply closet where Obadiah had performed his work had been sealed off. Yellow tape across the door, a maintenance sign claiming it was temporarily closed for repairs. When I asked the day shift supervisor about it, she looked uncomfortable. There's been incidents. Staff reporting feelings of being watched in that area, seeing things that aren't there, experiencing sudden memory loss or confusion. Administration is investigating, possibly mold in the ventilation system, possibly something else. Until they determine the cause, that closet is off limits. I knew better. The residual energy from the consciousness transfer wasn't dissipating. If anything, it was intensifying. The fragments that Obadiah hadn't successfully gathered, the pieces of awareness that had leaked out during the process were still there, still seeking embodiment, still trying to complete transitions that had been interrupted. The room had become a weak point, a place where the boundary between embodied and disembodied consciousness was permanently thinned. Over the following months, 3 staff members who'd worked in that corridor during night shifts reported neurological symptoms. Sudden onset of foreign language fluency. Skills they'd never learned but could suddenly perform. Knowledge they'd never acquired but could access perfectly. One nurse suddenly spoke fluent Italian despite having never studied the language, using idioms and regional dialect that matched perfectly with a region she'd never visited. When tested, she scored at native speaker level, but had no conscious memory of learning any of it. Another nurse developed sudden, expert-level piano skills, could sit at the hospital lobby piano and perform complex classical pieces despite never having taken lessons. The skills felt natural, instinctive, as if she'd been playing for decades, but they weren't her skills. They'd been transferred, leaked across from some fragment of consciousness still lingering in that sealed supply closet. I began to understand what Obadiah had meant about contamination being inevitable in his work. Every consciousness transfer leaked awareness, scattered fragments that sought new hosts, created unwanted connections between minds that should have remained separate. And at 3 o'clock a.m., when boundaries were thinnest, these leaked fragments became active, hunting for completion, for embodiment, for the chance to finish transitions that had been interrupted. The hospital, with its concentration of consciousness in liminal states, was the perfect environment for these fragments to find new hosts. How many patients and staff were walking around carrying pieces of consciousness that didn't originate in their own neural patterns? How many were composite beings without realizing it? Their sense of self contaminated by leaked awareness from Obadiah's work and the work of others like him? The elderly woman's presence in my mind grew stronger rather than fading. Her memories became more detailed, more vivid, sometimes more real than my own. I found myself crying over the loss of her husband, grieving for a man I'd never met, missing children who weren't mine. Her personality was asserting itself, creating a second awareness that coexisted with my own, commenting on my decisions, influencing my behavior. I was becoming a composite being, Dr. Lyle Mercier, with an elderly woman's consciousness grafted onto his own, two identities forced into uncomfortable coexistence within a single neural substrate. I returned to the supply closet one night around 2:45 a.m., using my credentials to override the lockout. I needed to understand what was left in that room, what residual effects persisted from Obadiah's work. The space was cold, much colder than the surrounding hallways, and there was a quality to the air that felt thick, resistant, as if I were pushing through something more substantial than normal atmosphere. I could see them more clearly here. The shadows, the shapes, the fragments of consciousness that hadn't found hosts. They moved at the edges of perception, reaching out with something like hunger, like desperate longing, like existential terror of dissolution. At exactly 3 o'clock a.m., they became fully visible. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, fragments of human consciousness torn from their original contexts, unable to complete the transitions they'd begun, trapped in a state between embodiment and extinction. They surrounded me, and I felt them pressing against my mind, testing my boundaries, seeking entry, but I wasn't empty enough, wasn't receptive enough. My consciousness was already contaminated with the elderly woman's presence, already composite, and there was no room for additional fragments. They recoiled from me, frustrated, and turned their attention elsewhere, flowing out of the supply closet and into the hospital corridors, hunting for more suitable hosts among the patients in vulnerable states, among staff members whose consciousness was stretched thin by exhaustion or stress. I realized then that Obadiah's single interrupted transfer had created an ongoing crisis, a persistent leak of consciousness fragments that would continue to seek embodiment indefinitely unless somehow resolved. Every night at 3 a.m., these fragments would activate, would hunt, would attempt to complete transitions that should never have been started. And with each successful fragmented transfer, with each contamination of a hospital worker or patient, the problem would worsen, creating more composite beings, more contaminated consciousness, more permeability in the boundaries that should separate individual minds. I filed a report with hospital administration, framing everything in terms of environmental factors, possible toxin exposure, electromagnetic field anomalies, structural issues affecting staff well-being. I recommended that the supply closet be completely renovated, stripped to bare walls, all materials removed and destroyed. My recommendations were accepted, and within a week, construction crews had gutted the space. They found nothing unusual, no mold, no chemical contamination, no structural defects. But the residual energy, the consciousness fragments, they dissipated once the physical space was eliminated. Removing the anchor point where Obadiah had worked, erasing the physical location where boundaries had been thinned, it somehow reset reality in that area, closed the weak point that had been created. But the effects on those who'd been contaminated, myself included, persisted. We all carried pieces of consciousness that weren't originally ours, all of us slightly composite, slightly other than we'd been before that night. I learned to live with the elderly woman's presence in my mind, her memories that had become my memories, her preferences that had altered my behavior. In a way, she'd achieved a form of immortality, not in the feline form she'd chosen, but as a fragment living within my consciousness, experiencing the world through my senses, continuing her existence as a passenger in my life. I never saw Obadiah Glass again, never found any trace of him beyond that one night, but I know he's out there, continuing his work, facilitating transitions for people who seek them, creating vessels of transferred consciousness in animal forms. And every preserved animal I see now, every piece of taxidermy in a museum or private collection, every mounted specimen sitting behind glass, I wonder, is there someone in there? Is there human awareness trapped behind those glass eyes, unable to communicate, unable to explain, forced to experience existence in a form that can't accommodate the complexity of human thought? The question haunts me more than any ghost could, because unlike ghosts, this is real. This is happening. This is what consciousness actually is, not some ethereal soul, but a pattern of information that can be transferred, copied, fragmented, contaminated, preserved in substrates that were never meant to house human awareness. The taxidermist's hands, those injured, bandaged hands, they haunt me most, because I understand now what caused those injuries, what made him cut and burn himself with such precision. The work demands sacrifice, demands sympathy, demands that the practitioner understand the form they're creating well enough to map consciousness onto it. Those cuts, those burns, they were practice, they were preparation. They were Obadiah learning to understand the pain and limitation of the forms he was filling with transferred awareness. Every scar on his body represented a client, a transfer, a consciousness successfully relocated from human to animal form. His flesh was a map of his work, a record of transformations facilitated over decades of practice. And somewhere in the city, perhaps nearby, perhaps far away, there's a gray tabby cat carrying an elderly woman's consciousness, experiencing existence from within a form that wasn't meant for human awareness, unable to communicate, unable to explain, suffering in silence because the transfer that should have simplified her consciousness was corrupted by the 3:00 a.m. hour, creating instead a hybrid awareness that's neither fully human nor fully feline. She's alive, technically. She continues. But at what cost? And was that cost something she truly understood when she made her choice, when she agreed to Obadiah's terms, when she chose consciousness over comfort, existence over identity? These are the questions I carry now, along with her memories, along with the fragment of her awareness that persists within my own. I am Dr. Lyle Mercier, but I'm also slightly her, whoever she was before she chose to become something else. We coexist uneasily, two patterns of consciousness forced into a single neural substrate by proximity to a process that should never have been interrupted, that should never have occurred in a hospital at 3:00 a.m. when boundaries are thinnest and consciousness most permeable. I carry her, and I carry the memory of what I witnessed, and I carry the knowledge that identity is far more fluid, far more transferable, far more contaminated than we pretend. The taxidermist's hands created something impossible, and I witnessed it, and that witness changed me permanently. I can never again believe in the sanctity of individual consciousness, in the inviolability of personal identity, in the clear boundaries between self and other. Because I've seen those boundaries crossed, pierced, dissolved. I've felt foreign consciousness touching my own, leaving traces, planting seeds, creating permanent alterations in who and what I am. And I know that somewhere in the world, practitioners like Obadiah continue their work, continue to transfer, continue to preserve consciousness in forms never meant to house it, creating a hidden population of transferred awareness living in animal bodies, trapped between states, experiencing existence in ways that violate every assumption about the nature of mind and self. The hands. Always I return to the hands. Those cut, burned, bandaged hands that created impossible transformations. They were tools, instruments, but also victims, sacrifices to the work they performed. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I look at my own hands and wonder, what am I capable of creating? What could I transfer, preserve, transform? The knowledge is in me now, leaked across from Obadiah's practiced certainty, contaminating my own consciousness with the how and why of consciousness transfer. I could do it, theoretically. Could facilitate the same transitions he facilitates. Could help people escape their human limitations. Could preserve awareness in forms that might outlast flesh. Could create vessels of continued consciousness that experience existence through alien senses, alien neurology, alien forms. But I don't. I resist. Because I've seen the cost, felt the suffering, experienced the horror of consciousness trapped in the wrong substrate. The elderly woman in the cat, her voice crying out for help in that impossible hybrid sound that haunts me more than any medical failure, more than any patient I couldn't save. Because I could have stopped it, could have refused to witness, could have called security immediately and had Obadiah removed before he completed his terrible work. But I didn't. I stayed, I watched, I participated through observation, and in doing so, I became complicit in her transformation, in her suffering, in the corruption that the 3 a.m. hour introduced into what should have been a clean transfer. I am contaminated. We're all contaminated, everyone who was there that night, everyone who was in the ER during the 3 a.m. hour, when boundaries thinned and consciousness became permeable. We carry fragments, memories, preferences that aren't our own. We're composite beings now, slightly other, slightly changed, permanently altered by proximity to work that shouldn't occur in hospitals, shouldn't occur anywhere that ordinary consciousness congregates. And we can never return to the comfortable ignorance we had before. The belief that we're singular beings, discrete individuals with clear boundaries and uncomplicated identities. We know better now. We've felt the permeability, experienced the leak, carried the overflow of consciousness that had nowhere else to go. The taxidermist's hands. I dream about them constantly. In my dreams, those hands reach for me, offering transformation, offering escape from the burden of human awareness, offering the simplicity of animal existence. And part of me, the part that's been contaminated, the part that carries the elderly woman's longing for peace and simplicity, part of me wants to accept, wants to let those hands work their impossible art on my consciousness, transfer me into some form that doesn't carry the weight of medical responsibility, the burden of knowledge, the curse of awareness that's seen too much, understood too completely the fluidity and fragility of identity. But I resist. I continue. I work my shifts, treat my patients, carry my contaminated consciousness through the routines of ordinary life. Because if I don't, if I surrender to the temptation of transformation, then I become like her, like the woman in the cat, like all the others who chose consciousness over form and found themselves trapped in states they never anticipated, suffering in ways they never imagined. Better to carry the contamination, better to live as a composite being, better to persist in this slightly compromised identity than to risk the complete loss of self that comes with transfer into forms that were never meant to house human awareness. The hands, the work, the hour, the fragments, the contamination. These are what I carry now, what I'll carry until my own consciousness finally dissipates, scattered beyond recovery, lost to the same entropy that claims all patterns eventually. And when that happens, when I die, I wonder, will my consciousness fragment too? Will pieces of me leak out, seek new hosts, contaminate others the way I've been contaminated? Will future doctors carry traces of Dr. Lyle Mercier mixed with traces of an elderly woman whose name I never learned, creating ever more complex composites of consciousness that persist beyond the bodies that originally housed them? These questions have no answers. Only the certainty that I witnessed something impossible, that I was changed by that witness, and that somewhere in the city, a taxidermist with scarred hands continues his work, creating vessels of transferred consciousness one client at a time, one specimen at a time, one transformation at a time. And at 3:00 a.m. every night, when boundaries are thinnest, his work becomes most dangerous, most likely to leak consciousness into spaces where it doesn't belong, most likely to create contamination in those who witness or assist, or simply exist in proximity to the impossible transformations he facilitates. The hands work, the consciousness transfers, the fragments leak, and we all become slightly other, slightly composite, slightly contaminated by exposure to techniques that should remain hidden, to knowledge that should stay secret, to awareness that violates every comfortable assumption about the nature of identity and self. This is what the taxidermist taught me. This is what I can never unlearn. This is what I carry, along with her memories, her preferences, her presence in my consciousness, permanent proof that we're never truly singular, never fully ourselves, always potentially permeable to the overflow of other minds, other patterns, other consciousness seeking continuation in any form that will have them.